L'chaim, 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 to life, l'chaim. So many of us think, when we think of that, we think of Fiddler on the Roof. I do. To life, l'chaim, 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 to life. We think of making l'chaims at various simchas. All right, we've got some coming up, some great simchas coming up. We make a l'chaim. Many of us maybe had l'chaims on New Year's Eve. I'm proud to say I didn't have a single sip of alcohol on New Year's Eve, and I was asleep by 8:30. I mean, New Year came in at 5 o'clock in London, so it was already 2021 where all my family were. So, but l'chaim is such an interesting word, isn't it? We associate it in Jewish life with drinking a shot of alcohol, but of course it's so much more than that when we say to life. And of course, this parsha, which is called Vayechi, and he lived, and yet it's about the deaths of both Yaakov and his son Yosef. Both die in this parsha. The only other parsha that mentions the root of the word life is Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, which is also about her death. So there's something about life and death that are so intimately connected throughout the book of Bereshit. Life and death, l'chaim, to life. We say to life, but we're honoring the legacies of people's death and the long lives that they live. In England, the tradition when someone is in their week of Shiva, and we actually have 3 members of our community who are in Shiva this week. In England, when you visit a Shiva home, we say, "I wish you long life. Wish you Chaim Arukim, a long life." And it's a powerful wish to give somebody. And of course, it's not just about length of life, it's about quality of life. And so as I think about going into a new year, into 2021, I think about what are the things that we do for ourselves that are life-sustaining and life-affirming. You know, it's so important as we continue this. This is far from over, obviously. This COVID situation is far from over. Yes, there's hopeful news about vaccines and things really may change, but it's going to be a few more months of this. So what do we do that's life-affirming? How do we take care of ourselves? And we all have different versions of that. For me, it's going for a walk with my dog every day. It's skiing. It's swimming most mornings. It's eating healthy food. It's going to bed early. Those are the things that are like, it's writing and getting in touch with my creativity is really, really important for me. That's life-affirming. But of course, it's not just about ourselves. It's about so much more than that. The newest use of the term l'chaim for me was something I discovered just this week when I read a very moving blog by Michael Zussman, Cantor Michael Zussman, who is the founder of l'chaim, which is Jews Against Capital Punishment. And it was an incredibly moving article about this idea when we're going into a new year and when we're reading a parsha that's about affirming life. What do we really think about life and what do we think about death? And I'm going to talk, and this may be upsetting to some of you, I'm going to talk about beginning of life and end of life. I'm going to talk about abortion, and I'm going to talk about the death penalty, because it seems to me these are really important things to talk about for us as a civilization as we move into this new year. I signed a petition along with thousands and thousands of other Jews on l'chaim. Cantor Michael Zussman is an ordained cantor from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and he's served as a federal prison chaplain, and he's worked with a lot of people on death row. And some of what he shares and some of what he's experienced is very harrowing in terms of the amount of times, and of course the most recent being in 2011, when someone who had been executed was actually found to be innocent. And this kind of thing happens all the time. And there is so much that has happened just in the last 6 months when it comes to this. In 2020, Colorado became the 22nd state in the union to actually abolish capital punishment. And Governor Polis pardoned the 3 people who were on death row. Death penalty was abolished. And many other states, in addition to the 22 who abolished it, have have celebrated 10 years of no actual state executions. But 2020 was also an extraordinary year in other ways, where for the first time in the recorded history of the United States of America, the federal government executed more people than all of the states combined. That has never happened before in American history. And it's pretty alarming that in the last months of this administration, there has been a rush through to execute certain people, that even the states and even family members of the victims have protested against, not wanting it. And yet somehow this administration has pushed them through. And it feels really important to say that in the last weeks of this presidency, there are still 3 people on death row that are going to be sort of rushed through to execution before January 20th. And the petition that I signed, and I urge you to sign too, is to really stay those and to beg President Trump and the acting Attorney General Rosen to, in the name of God, in the name of humanity, to grant clemency to Lisa Montgomery, Corey Johnson, and Dustin John Higgs. Now, from a Jewish perspective, you may say, but clearly Judaism condones capital punishment. It's all over the Torah. And it's true, it is all over the Torah. It is clear, if you read the Torah, that there is a case, a very strong case for capital punishment. And there are all kinds of examples of that. There are all kinds of violations that the Torah lists that are punishable by death. And then there are even different forms of capital punishment that are elucidated, things like stoning. But we know that the Torah is not an originalist document. You can't just take the Torah and define from the Torah the way in which we live our Jewish lives and our Jewish values and our Jewish ethics, because there have been thousands of years of interpretive tradition. And from very early on, the rabbis interpret ayin tachit ayin, shein tachat shein, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, not as literally ripping people's eyes and teeth out, but of monetary compensation, of compensating medical bills, of assessing the damage that you've done to another human being rather than yourself being inflicted in that punishment. And in fact, there's an incredibly strong statement in the Talmud by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in the Talmud in Makot, who says that any Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is basically like the rabbinic Supreme Court of the day, any Sanhedrin that institutes a death penalty one time in 70 years, is an inhumane and barbarous court. So there's a very strong opinion among the rabbis that capital punishment is something not to be condoned. Human life is valued, as we know, above all human life. In the story that we read in the Parsha, Joseph's brothers have done a terrible, terrible crime, which in some societies would be a capital offense, and yet they're completely forgiven. They're completely forgiven by Joseph, who doesn't even tell Pharaoh what their crime was. And I'm sure in an Egyptian court, they would have been tried and executed. And so there is this palpable sense in which the Torah, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs talks so eloquently about this, that forgiveness for any sin is possible within Jewish life. Teshuvah is possible in human life. We have story after story of people on death row who have been framed. People where in some states, and Alabama is the key state for this, where there are people who are framed for crimes that they clearly didn't admit, where juries are all white in persecuting and casting sentence on a black man who's been framed with false evidence. There are example after example after example of witnesses who've given false statements and admitted to their false statement, and yet their false statement upheld, and people still remain on death row. And so often, not entirely, but so often it is predominantly people of color who find themselves on death row, often with very little opportunity to have justice. Some of you know I was in Montgomery, Alabama, and I visited the EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, founded by Brian Stevenson, who's an amazing lawyer who wrote the book Just Mercy, and a film was made about that. And he has worked tirelessly with people on death row in Alabama and throughout the South, and taken a lot of these cases to the Supreme Court. Now, On the other end of life, l'chaim, l'chaim, to life, l'chaim, you might think, well, to life means I have to be pro-life. And of course we're pro-life. Jews are very, very much pro-life. But the way in which the pro-life, pro-choice agenda has become entirely politicized and become entirely a one-issue concern for so many people in this country, it is very, very disturbing. And I think it's important to understand the nuance and complexity that Jewish teachings have to say about abortion. Because the whole idea of people who claim to be pro-life, you would think that would apply to all life. But very often people who are pro-life are anti-abortion, but they're not really concerned about what happens to a child after it's born. They're not concerned about the conditions in which they grow up and in which they're raised. They're not concerned about what happens to somebody when they are abused as a child and how that affects their mental health as they grow older, and is often the cause of their crimes. Often people who are pro-life are pro-capital punishment. Often people who are pro-life are very strongly supporters of the Second Amendment. Often people who are pro-life are pro-wars where lots of people are killed. There seems to be an incredible disconnect here. I've never understood, and I've spoken a lot to my Christian friends to try to understand the theology that can say, on one hand, you are supporting the life of a one-day-old fetus, and yet you are also supporting the execution of people on death row. Joan Nagel brought to my attention an extraordinary woman who's also called Joan, Sister Joan Chittister, who in 2004 was interviewed by Bill Moyers, and she said something that became viral, but not in 2004, actually in 2019. And her quote is absolutely stunning to me. I read it in the National Catholic Reporter. Sister Joan Chichester is a Benedictine sister from the Benedictine order, a nun. And she says, I do not believe that just because you're opposed to abortion, that makes you pro-life. In fact, I think in many cases, your morality is deeply lacking if all you want is a child born, but not a child fed, a child educated, a child housed. And why would I think that you don't? Because you don't want any tax money to go there. That's not pro-life, that's pro-birth. We need a much broader conversation on what the morality of pro-life is. And the article goes on to talk about the extraordinary ways in which she's been an activist, and as a Catholic nun who, of course, is against abortion. In Judaism, it's much more complex. An embryo is not considered to be a viable life until it's 40 days old. But more importantly than that, the Mishnah, one of our main codes of Jewish law, says very, very explicitly that if a woman's life is in danger, then a fetus can be aborted for sure. And that is obviously not consistent with many of the far-right Christian views on abortion. But some commentators take it further than being just about the physical well-being of the woman and say it also applies to a mental situation. If she is pregnant as a result of a rape or incest or something like that, and having the baby is going to significantly damage her mental health, that is also considered to be a cause in some conditions. Of course, Judaism is complex, and so there are different opinions on all of these things, but it's so much, much more nuanced. And so the idea of pro-life is also about a woman's right to choose, a woman to make choices for her own body. When we talk about a Sanhedrin, which is this ancient rabbinic court, which had 70 people on it, not just 9, but I can't help thinking about it in terms of the Supreme Court that has upheld some of the capital cases, a Supreme Court that may actually overturn Roe v. Wade and some other cases about abortion. So I feel, and again, some of you I'm sure are very uncomfortable, like, why on the first Shabbat of the year does Rabbi Marc have to talk about this? Can't he give us an inspiring, hopeful message about the new year? Yes, I can give you an inspiring, I feel lots and lots of hope and enthusiasm and positivity about this coming year. But I just think, before this administration ends, it's really important to recognize, I didn't know this until this week. I didn't know about the number of federal executions that have taken place since July of 2020 and the fact that there are 3 more impending. And it just feels to me, from a fundamental position of Jewish ethics, it's just not okay. It's just not right. When we, and I feel so proud that Colorado did become the 22nd state to abolish capital punishment, when we're living in a world where public opinion every year gets stronger and stronger against capital punishment, when we hear more and more and more about family members of the victims not wanting the perpetrator of the crime in which their loved one was killed to actually be executed, and yet it is ignored, and in some cases potentially innocent people are sitting there on death row. So I want to say l'chaim. I want to say l'chaim. Vayechi Yaakov, Jacob lived. Jacob lived for 17 years, and Judaism gives us this incredible invitation to value human life, so that we as individuals, as I said at the beginning, we can really, really participate in activities in this coming year that are life-affirming, that are life-giving, that are nurturing, that are healing for us. We all need healing in 2021, regardless of whether we've been sick or not. We all need healing. We need mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical healing as we go into this year. So we want to affirm life for ourselves and for our families, but we also as a nation want to affirm life. We want to affirm life for a woman's right to make choices about her own body. We want to affirm life for people who are on death row, to get them off death row. We want to affirm life to get more than 22 states abolishing capital punishment. We want to hold President-elect Joe Biden accountable for the statement that he and his administration has made in terms of what they're going to say, where they say over 160 individuals who've been sentenced to death in this country since 1973 have later been exonerated because we cannot ensure we get death penalty cases right every time. Biden will work to pass legislation to eliminate the death penalty at the federal level and incentivize states to follow the federal government's example. These individuals should instead serve life sentences without probation and parole. That's a statement that's part of the Biden plan. So we want to encourage, and yes, this is somewhat political, but we want to encourage and affirm as Jews individually and collectively as community. We want to affirm life so that we can say, not just for ourselves and our community and our family, we want to say for the whole of this nation and the whole world, we want to be able to say, l'chaim, to life. Shabbat Shalom.